Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm going to show you how to clone a pair of linen shorts. Here I've got a pair of linen shorts, which I really like the fit of, but I want to update it with a brand new piece of fabric. So you'll need your shorts, a clear ruler, some pins, some chalk, anything that you like to mark your fabric with. And I've got here some clear tracing paper. You could use wrapping paper, it's your choice, and then some marking tools, pens, markers, whatever you like. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this pair of shorts, turn it upside down, kind of have an idea of what all the different pieces are and how I want to clone this. So I know I'm going to need a front panel here, and I'm going to take the front part of the hem, fold it in half here, matching the side seams together, and I'm marking halfway on the front hem. And you can mark this with a pin or some chalk. I'm just gonna stick a straight pin in here so I know that this is the center. This is gonna help me draw a line to indicate where the grain line of the fabric is, so I know how and where to cut it when I draw this pattern. So now I'm going to take my clear ruler and I'm going to line it up so that I'm going to line it up. As you can see, the bottom of the ruler here is lined up with the hem, so I want to make sure that line is straight. That's why I'm using a clear ruler. And now this is my grain line on my fabric. So I'm just going to put another pin up there just in case that chalk gets erased, so I know where that line is. Now I'm just going to cut a piece of tracing paper to trace the front. First, I'm going to draw a straight line in the bottom, and then I'm going to draw a perpendicular line with that in the center of that line here. This is going to indicate where the grain line of the pattern is. Now I'm going to line up the shorts for the front panel, and I'm going to position the center, that line, that vertical line, with where I pinned it, and I'm just going to go ahead and pin this to the paper on that line so I know this is going to be lined up vertically with a grain line. And now I'm just going to go ahead and pin at the side seam as well to keep that hem aligned with that horizontal line in the bottom, because I want my hem to line up with that line. And then go ahead and pin it on the other side as well. And then of course I'm going to pin also at the top where I had pinned it, and I'm just pinning along that chalk line that I drew. Once I have these 3 pins, I'm going to take this tracing wheel here, and I'm going to trace along some of these seam lines. If you don't have a tracing wheel, you can actually use a pin. What you'll do is you'll take the pin and stick it right exactly along the seam line on the side seam. I'm just sticking the pin into where this was sewn, and then if I pick up the shorts, I can see where that pin was, and I'm also lining up the bottom where the side seam starts, and I'll just mark these 2 edges here on the bottom of the side seam, and then where I'm positioning these pins. And I'll do that all the way along this side seam. And one thing to keep in mind, at the top we've got the elastic, so it's pulling the fabric more to the side, but we'll adjust for that in a minute. You can just pull it like this and make sure you can kind of guess. This does not have to be perfect. We can kind of guess where that's going to be later. So now that I've got the pins, I'm going to go ahead and mark these. Before I adjust the top, we'll adjust the top in a minute. And then I'm also marking where the waistband starts. Now I can do the same thing here on the inseam. I can take these pins and stick them through the seam line allowance and just start marking it from the back. I want to pick this up so I can see where that pin was inserted and just make a pencil mark, and then I can follow these and clean these lines up later, which you'll see in a minute. Here I've stuck the pin right where the edge of the crotch is, and then I'm squaring it out to make sure I indicate where it squares up and down on the crotch seam. Now for the crotch, I'm gonna just show you guys how you can use the tracing wheel. You'll just trace right along the seam line. And then I'm going to trace up away from that center because I know the elastic is going to stretch further out. All right, now I'm going to take those pins out and I'm going to finish up this front panel. And now I can feel where the tracing wheel marks are and go ahead and pencil those in. Now I want to measure the waist. So where I pinned the center and where the side seam is about 5 inches. Now if I pull it, the elastic stretches out to 6 inches. So I know I want that area to be 6 inches from the center perpendicular line. So now I know where to square down to where the side seam was. And I can ignore that line I drew earlier, and I'm using this ruler called a hip curve. And I'm going to draw this line straight up to where that 6-inch mark was. And that's going to be our side seam. Now for the crotch, I'm just going to go ahead and draw a straight line to where the crotch squared down. Now for the elastic waist from the center to the inseam, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to measure from that pin mark where it marks the center to where the side seam was. And this measures around 4 inches or so. And then if I stretch it out, I can see how much longer it needs to be. And it measures about 5 inches. So now from that center line that I have, I want to measure across 5 inches and mark that point. And then my crotch line should, and then now my crotch line, I'm going to go ahead and draw it up to that point. And we'll measure all these now in a minute. I'll show you guys how to make sure it matches your shorts that you're cloning. I'm going to take the crotch area here of the shorts and I'm going to match it up with the line that I drew to see and make sure that the length matches. This part's kind of important. The crotch, if you get the crotch wrong, these will not fit correctly. So just measure it up and mark where the crotch length ends. Same with the side seam. I'm going to measure from the bottom of the hem all the way up to where the elastic starts and match it up with my line that I drew and make sure those two match. I'm going to go ahead and mark where that ends. You can see I was a little bit off on both of these. Again, in the inseam, go ahead and measure up the inseam, make sure that matches. And I should have done this before I did the crotch because it should come up with where that crotch line was. But let's see if this matches. So you see, I will have to go up just a little bit. So I'm going to move this inseam up and redraw the crotch. So next time, for you when you do this, you might want to do the inseam before you do the crotch. Now I'm going to go ahead and measure it from that point up and remark this crotch seam. Now I'm going to go ahead and also trace the outline of this so I can match it and draw it with my hip curve. You can freehand it as well if you don't have one of these, as long as your line curves nicely. And I'm going to just cross mark the other lines that I'm not using so I know which line is my actual line for my pattern. And you can always double check the crotch by measuring it as well, because if you get the crotch wrong again, it's just not going to fit you right. So you can take your measuring tape and go ahead and measure it. So I've got 9 inches here. Now I want to make sure the line that I drew is 9 inches. If not, I'm going to go ahead and adjust it. So as you can see, I am off just a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and adjust where that line ends, and I have my crotch seam now. And then cross out that old mark. Now I can connect the waist. And again, I'm using my hip curve here. For this part, you could also use just a straight ruler. So I'm just going to go over this with my marker to make sure my lines are nice and clear on my pattern now. So I'm just going over the lines for the pattern with a marker so they're nice and clear and I know which lines are the actual pattern lines. Now to add seam allowance on the hem, I'm going to use the clear ruler and I'm going to mark an inch down from the bottom of this because I want my hem to be hem allowance to be about 1 inch. And then for the side seam, I'm gonna give myself a 1/2 inch. You can give whatever you like for your hem allowance. I'm gonna do 1/2 inch everywhere and 1 inch for the hem. I'm just gonna go ahead and use a red marker so you can see the difference between the seam allowance and the actual sew lines. Now for the waistband, I want to measure what this waistband is. It's about 2 inches. So I'm going to extend my pattern so that it's all in one and I don't have to create a separate waistband. And it's going to be much easier to sew as well. So I'm going to go ahead and give myself about 4 inches plus seam allowance, because remember this is going to fold down 2 inches on the front, 2 inches on the back for 4 inches plus some seam allowance to fold that thing under on the inside. So I'm extending the waist by 4.5 inches, 2 inches for the waistband and then 1/2 inch for the seam allowance. Now I've cut this, and the reason I cut this is before I cut the side seam, I'm gonna fold over the elastic part where the waistband is going, and then I'm going to cut it because as you'll see when I open it, we need it to match when we're sewing this, and if I just cut it straight, it's not going to match the inside will be slightly shorter, so you'll see it's going to bow out a little bit here. So just go ahead and line it up with the side seam. I'm going to just draw the line to make sure I cut this correctly. So I'm going to cut it as if how I would have that waistband when I actually sew it towards the inside of the shorts. So I folded under the seam allowance, and then I folded it over to where I would cut it, and then I'm gonna go ahead and just cut through all the layers this way, and that way my allowance for the waist will be cut correctly. And we're gonna do the same thing for the hem, because if we don't fold the hem and I cut it straight, it's not going to cut out correctly. So let's fold the hem. I'm gonna first cut the side seams, and then before I cut the hem, I'm gonna fold it over just like I did for the waistband, and then I'll cut through. So now when I unfolded it, you can see the hem comes out a little bit at the bottom here, and it's not a straight line on the inseam especially. All right, and this wraps up the front part of the shorts. So I'm just gonna go ahead and mark it as a front, and we're gonna cut 2 of these, one for each side of the front, of course. We're gonna double this. Now for the back panel, I'm repeating exactly the same thing. So I've got my hem center marked, and then I'm lining up the clear ruler with the edge of the hem to make sure it's a straight line up. And it looks a little bit awkward where the grain line is, but trust me, this is where your grain line will end up, especially if you look closely at your fabric. This, of course, might be that these shorts have stretched out over time, which is okay. When you cut your new fabric, it'll turn out fine. So I'm again marking it, and I'm just going to go through the same exact steps that I did on the front, and I'm going to trace it and add the seam allowance, etc. Okay, now I've got my front and back panels both drawn out and marked and cut out. The next thing I'm going to do is create the pocket for my shorts. I do like the pocket, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I've got a piece of tracing paper. I'm lining it up with the front panel, and I'm just going to line it up with my sew lines on these so I can mark where the pocket edges are. And first I'm gonna do the top portion, and I'm gonna make the pocket extended just about to the center line where the grain line was. Or actually, maybe a little bit shorter than that center line. You can make your pockets bigger or smaller, it's up to you. So I'm marking a notch here so I know where I'm gonna line it up. And then I'm going to mark on that side seam as well so I can line up my pocket correctly when I sew this. And again, I'm marking where the sew line of the side seam of the front is to trace my pocket. And then I'm squaring out at the bottom. And then I'm squaring down, and then I'm just gonna do a little curve here, and I'm not gonna extend past that grain line. And I'm just freehanding this. You can use your curvy ruler or something if you don't feel comfortable doing it this way. So this is a side seam pocket. And again, I'm just gonna line it up here, make sure my pocket lines up, and then I'm gonna mark the edge of the pocket so when I pin this together and I sew it, I can mark these as notches. Right, and I'm just marking the grain line here so I know where to cut the pocket, and then I'm going to finish it off by drawing a darker line. And that wraps up the pattern drafting to clone a pair of shorts. Of course, I'm going to add seam allowance to this pocket and finish it up. In the next video, I'm going to walk through the steps and the sewing construction for these shorts. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and you found it useful. If you did, please hit that like button, subscribe to my channel so you can get updates when I upload new videos. And I hope to see you guys in the next video. Happy sewing!